I've been asked as a member of the home team to say something about infant nutrition, and I'm really pleased to be doing that. I worked with David for a very long time and I'm pleased to be here. But really, much more importantly than that, I think it's an opportunity to recognise the immense contribution David made to the way we think about infancy as a period in early postnatal life and how important it is. And it's not something we've heard so much about today. Now, I stuck very faithfully to the brief about thinking about future science, but I just wanted to go backwards first and just say something about policy and policy changes. Now, I have to admit, I was a PhD student back in the 1980s, and I still have a copy of this report on my shelf in the office. It was then a national policy document, the first of its kind really, from the Coma Committee, and it sets out what was then present-day practice in infant feeding. And the reason for including it is to say something about the scope of this report, which was that it was chiefly concerned with the continued well-being of healthy infants. Now, if we go 10 years down the line from there, Coma convened another working group, again focusing on the infant diet. And this would have been published in 1994, so really a handful of years after the first Hertfordshire findings were published in the Lancet in 1989. So these were almost contemporary, the findings and also the development of this document. And yet, if we look at the very first sentence of the introduction, there's a shift in thinking. Nutrition in the early years of life is a major determinant of growth and development, and it also influences adult health. And that was a real permanent shift in the way that we think about infancy. And I think it speaks volumes about the importance of these findings, but also the impact they made and how rapidly. Okay, so those themes, thinking about life course and early developmental effects on growth and development and later function, are absolutely core to so many of our policy documents and expert reports and so on. It's just a handful from the past 5 years or so. But it's also the way that part of the way that we're communicating now to the general public. This is an example from the Start for Life campaign, and it's promoting the benefits of breastfeeding. And part of that, the recognised benefits are not just in short-term survival, but actually promoting the benefits in the long term, both for the infant and indeed for the mum. So why should we think about infants separately? What's special about them? Well, of course, you didn't need to stay all day to know that infants grow very rapidly. But just to make that point, this is a height velocity curve for an individual between birth and 18. And I'm just highlighting the bit there, which is the growth in the first year. So it's really rapid. And that rapid growth brings its own nutritional needs to support the growth to its potential. But also the infant is completely dependent on other people for its own nutritional needs, and it's vulnerable at that time. It's not just about linear growth. This shows brain growth, which is a feature of growth in the first year. This scheme sets out brain growth from 0 to 2 years, with the adult brain weight represented at the top. And the proportion of that gained weight achieved in the period of infancy really speaks for itself. And thinking about critical periods, windows of susceptibility, I think the implications of adverse influences and poor nutrition at this time are quite clear. Now, of course, we'd known for a really long time, way back before the 1980s, that manipulation of early postnatal nutrition could achieve long-term and permanent changes in physiology and growth. And this is a very well-known example, but a clear example of doing just that. We're looking at the growth of 2 groups of rats. The control group, who are left to their own devices, are the open circles, and the experimental group, their litter mates, are the closed circles. And for a period just after weaning, that's the vertical arrow, for a 3-week period, they're undernourished and their weight gain slows dramatically. Food is then restored and it picks up, but that deficit in growth, that difference, remains with them. It's irrecoverable. Now, it was David and Clive and colleagues using the Hertfordshire data who showed us for the first time that these interesting animal findings had real relevance in a human context. And you're all very familiar with this, so I don't need to say very much about it other than to say that the infants who had grown most poorly and in terms of the weight that they attained at the end of the first year of life were those who had the highest risk of having coronary heart disease much later on, some 60 years down the line. So where do we go from here? Well, this is sort of the next half of this really is more sort of my personal views on what we should be doing and really how we're going to pursue this agenda over at the Life Course Epidemiology unit. Where we've come to so far is inevitably depends on historical cohorts, so that we've been able to look at adult degenerative disease and indeed mortality. But of course, life was so different then, and that also applies to patterns of infant feeding, which were completely different if we go back, say, to the 1930s. So what we need to do next is to translate these findings into contemporary populations and understand not just what's happened in the past and the potential for programming effects, but what's going to happen next and how we think future generations are going to do. And that's, I think, our overarching aim. Now, to do that, I think there are three particular challenges which I've identified as being top of my list, and I'm just going to say something very briefly about each of those with a view to developing the science. Now, the first of these, we had a very interesting talk about growth patterns this morning, and I don't want to say very much about this other than to say that we need to know more about what represents optimal pathways of early growth. This builds directly on the beautiful and sort of study carried out by David and Johan Eriksson and colleagues in using the Finnish data, where they showed quite clearly that there were specific patterns of growth linked to the development of coronary heart disease. So these men were short relative to the cohort. We've seen this data already today, so I won't labour this point. But that a feature of their growth was poor weight gain and low BMI. These kids were thin in the period of infancy, but that the worst pattern of growth was that this was associated with relatively rapid childhood growth. By the age of 11 or 12, they were of average BMI, but of course how they'd achieved that point, whether they'd worked their way across the dotted line or whether they'd actually come through this particular pathway, would tell us so much more about what was going to happen going forwards. So the second challenge is about developing that evidence base, a contemporary evidence base to understand really current patterns of feeding, what we think is optimal. And ultimately what we're trying to do is consider some of the practical implications of having a new baby in your house and what to feed it, how you help them through that transition. You start off on a milk-based high-fat diet, and by the end of the first year, which is a very short time, you're actually eating family foods. And quite how you achieve that for any individual going through that transition, how fast what you eat and how fast you do that and so on. There are practical things to communicate, and we need to know what represents optimal. What we've learned from the Southampton Women's Survey, which Cyrus has already referred to, is that things are incredibly different in different households. And this is just to illustrate some of the differences in milk feeding. They're just simple descriptive data from the SWS infants when they were 6 months old. I've divided them into 4 groups to represent, really make some sort of statement about their pattern of milk feeding over the first 6 months. But actually this could have been rainbow coloured with millions of sectors to actually express the sort of complexity of all the different combinations of breast milk and formula milk and lots of different brands and swapping the brands and exclusivity and duration and all sorts of things. So it is a bit complicated, and there are real nutritional implications for some of those changes. What I learned from the SWS particularly, though, was that the variability in the weaning diet was also huge, and this I hadn't expected to see. These are data from SWS, infants aged 12 months. They've been divided up according to their dietary pattern score at that age, and that dietary pattern tells us about their compliance with infant feeding guidance. So the most compliant infants are in the green bars, the least compliant are in the blue bars, and we're looking across the gradation of scores for each group, for each food. And it's just to make the point that the variability in consumption is really huge. And what we need to know much more about is how much those differences matter and indeed why they matter. Now, as a nutritional epidemiologist, you might have expected me to say something dull like this, which is that characterising infant nutrition and capturing those differences in the infant exposures is absolutely central to us making progress. So it's not just about what methods and which questionnaires and whether to use a diary or not. It's about knowing what the questions should be and quite what information we're trying to capture, whether we're interested in children at different ages, chronological ages or stages. Timing's key. We need common approaches we use across cohorts to enable future meta-analysis and collation of data. And I'm a huge fan of very simple statements, and there must be very simple information we could collect, which we could build into routine data collection to help us to develop this evidence base for the future. Just to say something about complexity, David did once describe me as the most miserable person he'd ever worked with. And so I would like to continue in that tradition. And just to say something about ascribing causality to the influences we see in infancy is a little bit tricky. And even if we know something very simple about infants, whether they're breastfed or formula fed, we have to recognise there are all sorts of interrelationships with other factors. So if we know an infant is breastfed, that will also be telling us about differences in age of introduction of solid foods. It will be telling us about the quality of their weaning diet, and it will also tell us about the childhood diet. On top of that, it will tell us about differences in social background of the family, and also tell us about differences in maternal diet. And we've heard a lot about prenatal influences today, and so we just need to recognise that some of the postnatal feeding decisions are also related to those earlier exposures. So it's not all gloomy though, and there are lots of really great things that are happening, and the DOHAD agenda has spawned just a huge number of infant studies, and so we have a huge evidence base that's developing, and we will know much more going forward, so it's a really exciting time. It would be really great if we could try to bring common approaches together to characterise exposures so that we could make even better data sets and look for consistency across studies. And that particularly applies to populations where confounding structures are different, so perhaps infant feeding is not so influenced by social background and so on. And I know that's a theme of the cohorts collaboration that many people here are involved in. But I did just want to say one more thing, that while we're developing the science, embedding our observations alongside mechanistic studies and starting to really understand where we're going, there are things that we can do now. And we can already recognise that there are infants in our population and young children in the population who are already obviously quite vulnerable, and that's really however we characterise them. And I just want to show you two new slides of data from the SWS to make that point. So the lines on this graph represent 4 different groups of infants. In every case, the infants are assessed at 6 months and 12 months, 3 years and 6 years. That's their dietary assessment. So at each age, we know about the quality of their diet. Better quality, better diet, as you might imagine. And because diet quality is quite similar for any given individual over these ages, we can actually group them relatively simply into 4 distinct groups. And I just draw your attention really to the line at the bottom, the black line. These are infants who are, when we assess them, have a poor diet quality at every single age we see them, and that just can't be the best place to be. Now, there are kids in the population who are doing much better, that's the blue line at the top, and obviously some in the middle. But we can recognise that these children at the bottom are vulnerable infants in our population, and they're there now. And what's more, we can pretty much identify them at 6 months, so really early on in infancy we can see some of those differences, and we can forecast what's coming. In terms of whether it matters, well, this is work in progress, but just to show you a graph here looking at adiposity in these children at the age of 6, and the same groups are colour-coded as they were previously. So if we look at this group who are the most vulnerable, they already at the age of 6 have significantly increased fat mass. They're not necessarily identifiably fat in terms of body mass index, but in terms of adiposity, there's a very clear link across these groups. And the best place to be is being fed a high quality diet, as you might expect. We've adjusted for all sorts of obvious confounders, as you would expect, and of course this is a strongly significant association. Just to finish, I hope I've done justice really to David's contribution, particularly thinking in the context of early nutrition, about early postnatal nutrition, and the permanent change it caused in the way we think about infancy and how important this period is. Having worked with David for a long time, however exciting the science was, I always felt that there was a very strong mission, which was that what ultimately we're trying to do is to improve human health, and particularly to consider families who are very vulnerable. And so I think although I'd really like to enjoy the science and keep that going, there are things we can do now, and I know that Mary's going to talk to that agenda next. Thank you very much.